I'm Algebra Annie, and I am here to help you be successful in your algebra class. It always seems impossible until it is done. Nelson Mandela. Our learning targets today are: I can write a linear equation in slope-intercept form. I can graph a line using slope-intercept form.
So now we're going to talk about slope-intercept form. So they want us to graph the line with a slope of -2 and with a y-intercept of 4. We remember slope and y-intercept from a couple of previous lessons, so let's take a moment to review what these mean. If you remember, our slope is supposed to represent how much we moved across our line. And if you remember, slope was the rise over the run. Well, what was our rising axis? Our rising axis is the axis that goes up and down. That is our y-axis. So we are subtracting our y's. And the run axis is the one that you could physically run across. The axis you can physically run across is the x-axis. So you are subtracting our x's. You remember slope was a fraction. This is how we change to go from one point to another on our line. They are telling us that our slope is -2. Well, you said slope had to be a fraction. -2 is not a fraction. You are able to change a whole number into a fraction by putting it over 1. So our slope is now a fraction. So we know that we move across our line by going down 2. So we would have to go down 2 and then over 1. Over 1. This is how we would move across our line. But where do we start? The y-intercept tells us where we start. If you remember, our y-intercept tells us where we cross the y-axis. If the y-intercept tells us where we cross the y-axis, then we know exactly one point on our graph. You told us my y-intercept was 4. So if you are telling me that my y-intercept is 4, I know that I cross my y-axis at 4. Well, what point would that be then? I know that that is the coordinate point. It's the y-axis, so x, y. That meant the 4 was y. If it's an intercept, that meant the other number had to have been 0. So I know one point on my graph. So I'm going to come over, I'm going to plot that one point on my graph. So the point 0, 4 crosses the y-axis at 4. So there's my one point on my graph. And my slope tells me how I move across the line. So I know that I'm supposed to go down 2 over 1 to find my new point. So if I'm starting right here, I need to go down 2. So if I went down 2 and over 1, I found my new point right here. You said that I moved down 2 over 1 all the way across the line. So I'm going to continue to go down 2 over 1, down 2 over 1. And every time I go down 2 over 1, I'm supposed to make a new point, down 2 over 1. So now that I have a couple of points listed, so I just need to take my ruler, make sure that I line up all of the points that I marked, and then connect them all with a solid line. And my line needs to have little arrows on the end of each. So I went down 2 over 1, and every time I went down 2 over 1, I found a new point. Now all these little lines down here are just to help you as a student starting to learn this, find where my new points are. Your graph does not have to look like this. Let's take a look and see how it would look if you didn't draw all those. So if I wanted to draw that graph but not make as much marking so it was easier to see, I need a starting point. My starting point is crossing the y-axis at 4, and you told me that I had to go down 2 over 1. So I can physically go down 2 over 1 and just not draw the down 2 over 1 lines like we did before. So now that I see I've go down 2 over 1 each time, I've got all my points, and then you could go ahead, take your ruler and connect all the points you made with a solid line, and that is the line of the graph they asked you to make. It's a much cleaner graph. This is our goal in the end, to not have to draw all those little lines, but you could always go back and double check yourself. So you told me that I had to go down 2 over 1. That means if I start on any point, I should be able to go down 2 over 1 and find that next point. Down 2 over 1, I should run into the line. If I started at this point, if I went down 2 over 1, I should run into the line. So you could always still go back, use the slope, and confirm that your line is correct. So our new problem is to graph the line with a slope of 2 and a y-intercept of -3. The first thing we need to do is we need to figure out where does my line start. So I got to figure out where on my graph to start my line. Well, a slope of 2 tells me how I move across the line. That does not tells me where to start. The y-intercept at -3 tells me where I'm starting. So my y-intercept tells me where to start, and you told me my y-intercept was -3. So you could either go immediately to the y-axis and know that it crosses at -3 and put your point there. Or you can convert this to a point. Here's my xy coordinate point. If it is a y-intercept, that meant that number was the y-coordinate. And since it was an intercept, that meant your other number had to be 0. My x had to be 0. The coordinate point 0, -3 is the coordinate point you just plotted. So now that I know where to start, the second thing I need to do is, where are my next points? So where are my next points going to be? The slope tells me how I move across my line. So the slope tells me where my next point is going to be. If you remember, slope is supposed to be rise over run. The rise is the change in your y's, while the run is the running axis. It was the change in the x's. So my slope is 2. So my slope is a +2. But if you look, our slopes are always represented by fractions. This slope needs to be changed into a fraction. How do you change a whole number into a fraction? You put it over 1. Now that I have a fraction slope, the top number is my rising, is a +2, which means I am going up 2. The bottom number is the running. So that means I'm going over +1. So I go over 1. So from the point I already started at, I'm supposed to go up 2 over 1. So I'm going to go up 2 over 1. There's my new point. 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 So these are all my new points. I have plenty of points to be able to connect and make a line. So you have to grab your ruler so you have a very straight line. Grab my new marker. Connect all the points so they're in a very straight line. And make sure you have little arrows because this is a line that goes on infinitely in both directions. So now I have my line. If you needed to double check yourself and make sure that you are doing your slopes accurately, your slope is up 2 over 1, meaning no matter what point I start at, if I went up 2 over 1, I should run into the next point. Start here. If I went up 2 over 1, I should run into the line again. That's why the slope was up 2 over 1. It gets you to the next point every time. Our next point, they want us to graph the line that has a slope of -2/3 and a y-intercept at 1. First, we need to know, where do we actually start putting our points? So our first thought is, where do I start? So I have to start on a single point. The y-intercept tells us where to start. My y-intercept is 1. What is that as a coordinate point? Well, coordinate points are supposed to be xy coordinate points. If it is the y-intercept, then he is the y. Because it is an intercept, it had to be on an axis, which means the other has to be 0. So the point 0, 1 is where I cross 1 on the y-axis. So right here, 1 on the y-axis is the coordinate point 0, 1. So I know I start right there. So now the next thing I need to think about is, where are my other points? So if I know where I started there. How do I find my next point? That's where slope comes into play. So slope is supposed to be rise over run. And if you remember, the rising axis is the y-axis, so it's how we change across our y's. The running axis is our x-axis, so this is how we change across our x's. The slope, they tell us, is a fraction of -2/3. The fraction is a negative, so who gets the negative number? I read it as -2/3. So I'm going to put the negative to the top number. If the top number is a negative number, -2, if I rise -2, that means I'm actually falling. So I'm going down 2. The bottom number is my running, so I have to run across 3. So down 2 over 3. So if I started here, I now need to move down 2, down 1, 2 over 3. 1, 2, 3. There's my next point. Down 2, 1, 2 over 3. 1, 2, 3. Down 2 over 3. So now that I have all of my points, I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to connect them all. And make sure your line has little arrows on the end to show that it goes infinitely in both directions. And you can go across and just kind of double check your work. So if I found a point on the line, here's a brand new point that I have not plotted yet. If I went down 2 over 3, did I run into the line? I did. So any one point you find, if you went down 2 over 3, you should run into the line again. So there, if I went down 2 and over 3 more, I ran straight into my line, which means I graphed it correctly. So now we're going to go over what the slope-intercept form of a linear equation looks like. You may already be familiar with it. It is the equation y equals mx plus b. Y and x will remain as y and x the entire time. The only variables that change are going to be our m and our b. You should already be familiar with m. We've talked about m in a few lessons. You'll remember that m is the variable that we use to represent slope. So you will replace the letter m, the variable m, with whatever number represents our slope. The other variable that is going to change is going to be the b. The b is going to be our y-intercept. So this equation is called the slope-intercept form because this equation gives you both the slope and the intercept when you read it. So now we're going to do an example problem. They give you the slope. Remember, my slope was m, so this is going to be my new m. And they give me a y-intercept. So this y-intercept is going to be my b. So if I have to write the equation, it's y equals, I need my m. They told me my m was 1/3. The x still stays in there, so x plus, I need a b. I know my b. My b is 6. So I replaced my slope with 1/3. I replaced my y-intercept with 6. Any number connected to the variable x is going to be the slope. Slope is always connected to the variable x. So what is your final answer? Your answer is y equals 1/3 x plus 6 would be the slope-intercept form of the line if you graphed it with that information they gave us. And you're done. So our next example, they want us to come up with the slope-intercept form of the problem that has a slope of 0 and a y-intercept of -5. My equation is y equals, so I need to know what my m is. M represents my slope, so my slope is 0. This is supposed to be my m. So I have a 0 connected to my x because slope is always connected to x, plus, and then it's supposed to have my b. My b is represented by my y-intercept. My y-intercept was -5, which means my entirety of b is going to be -5. Sometimes these equations can be simplified. If I have 0 times x, that meant I had 0 x's, which means you kind of don't really even write it. So y equals, we're not even really going to write this because 0 times x is just 0. We just have the -5. So y equals -5 would be our final answer. So our next example, I have a slope of -12 and a y-intercept of 1/2. We want the slope-intercept form. So my slope-intercept form is y equals, so y equals, I need to know what m is. M is my slope. My slope is a -12. So -12, and slope is always connected to the x. So it's -12x plus, I then need my y-intercept. My y-intercept right here is -1/2. So I have a -1/2. So if I were going to simplify this, I have y equals -12x remains -12x, and plus a -1/2 could be just -1/2, and you could be done. Our next example, they give us a slope of 1 and a y-intercept of 0. We want slope-intercept form. Slope-intercept form is y equals, I then mean my slope. They tell me my slope is 1. So I have a slope of 1. Slope is always connected to x. So my 1 needs to be connected to my x. Then I'm supposed to add my y-intercept. My y-intercept is 0. So I'm adding 0. Now simplify things down if you can. Y equals 1 times x is just 1x, so just x, plus 0 is plus 0. There's nothing there. So y equals x is your final answer. So they still want us to find the slope-intercept form of the line, but this time they don't tell us the slope and they don't tell us the y-intercept. This time they give us the graph and we need to find what that information is. So the slope is how we move across the line. And if you remember the slope formula, it was rise over run. So I need to start at a point and I need to see how I move across. Well, I see 2 points. So if I started at this point, how do I get from this point to the next one on the line? I can see that it would have been going up 2. So I would have had to have gone up 2 and I would have ran over 1. So I know my slope is going to be the slope of 2 over 1. 2 over 1 simplifies down to 2. So I know my slope is 2. But I also need my y-intercept. The y-intercept is where you cross the y-axis. I see that I cross the y-axis right here, and I see that's the number 1. So I know that my y-intercept is 1. So now that I have a slope, and now that I have a y-intercept, I have all the information I need to come up with a slope-intercept form. So slope-intercept form was y equals, I need my slope. You told me my slope was 2. Slope is 2. If 2 is slope, slope has to be connected to x. So there's my x. Formula says that I need to add, and I'm adding my y-intercept. You told me my y-intercept was 1, so I'm then adding 1. If it can be simplified, you need to simplify it. Y equals 2x just stays as 2x, and plus 1 just stays as plus 1. So it was already in simplest form, and you're done. So this is supposed to be the line that crosses at 1. It crosses at 1, and the slope would have been going up 2 over 1 every time to get to a new point. So now the problems get a little bit more difficult. They tell us our slope, which is one of the points that we needed, but then they don't give us the y-intercept, which is another point that we needed. They gave us a point instead. So using the equation they gave us, we have y equals, I know my slope is 4, so y equals 4. If 4 is really slope, I need to connect it to x, and I'm supposed to add my y-intercept. I don't have a y-intercept, so I still just have my b. This is all the information that they gave us to fill in our formula. However, if you look closely, they did give us an xy coordinate point. We're going to use that xy coordinate point in our problem. So if I had y was 5, so this is really 5 equals, it was already a 4. 4 is being stuck to the x by multiplication. So 4 is stuck to 2 by multiplication, so it's really 4 times 2. And my equation is still being added to b. I need to figure out what my b is. That was the only other missing part to come up with the true equation. So we're going to solve this for b using our Chapter 2 skills. So 5 equals 4 times 2 is 8 plus b. If I subtract 8 from each side, I end up getting -3 equals b. So b is my y-intercept. I just found my y-intercept. So I really do now have the slope that I needed. There's my slope. And I just found my y-intercept. So I can actually come up with an answer now. So slope-intercept form, y equals, I need slope. I've always known slope. Slope was 4. If that is really slope, it needs to be connected to x. And now I'm supposed to add my y-intercept of b. You just found b. b is -3. So there is -3. The x and y stay as x and y's in my final formula. Now simplify this if you can. Y stays as y equals 4 times x is still just 4x. And if I'm adding a -3, that's the same thing as subtracting 3. And so this is my equation, and I'm done. So we're going to do another problem where all they give us is slope. They don't give us our y-intercept. We have to use the other information they gave us to try and figure out what y-intercept is. So fitting in what we currently have, the equation is y equals, I need a slope. They gave me my slope. My slope is 8. So here's my slope of 8. If that's really slope, it needs to be connected by the x to say that he's slope. The equation then says plus, and I'm supposed to add my y-intercept. I don't have a y-intercept, so there's my b. This is all the information that they gave me for my equation. So now I need to actually use the xy coordinate point they gave us to fill in and see if we can actually find b. So y was 1. I'm supposed to then equal 8. 8 is stuck to the x by multiplication, so 8 is actually stuck to my -3 by multiplication. And this whole thing is still being added to b. I need to discover what b is. That will then give me my y-intercept. So 1 equals 8 times -3 is a -24. This is being added to b. I need to solve for b. So I'm going to add 24 to both sides. 1 plus 24 is 25. The 24 is 0 out. I'm left with b equaling 25. Now that I found the missing part of my equation, I can go back in. Y equals, I need slope. Slope was 8. So here is my slope. If that is really slope, slope is supposed to be connected to x, plus I need a y-intercept. I need a b. You just told me my b was 25. So my b is 25. If you can simplify it down, you'd need to. Y is just y. 8 times x is still just 8 times x. And a positive 25 is still just a added 25. And you're done. The x and y needs to remain as x and y. We only put it in so we could actually figure out what b was, since they did not give it to us to begin with. So now I need to write the equation in slope-intercept form, which means they're going to give me an equation that's not in slope-intercept. I need to put it into slope-intercept, and then I need to graph it. So this is the equation they give us. Let's check to see if it's in slope-intercept form. So y equals a number times x, and then I need a plain old number. I do have a plain old number. So this is already in slope-intercept form. So the first job is already done. So now let's pull out the information that we know. The number stuck to the x is slope. So what is my slope? My slope is a 4. But if you remember right, slope needs to be a fraction. 4 is not a fraction. The only way to make it a fraction is to put it over 1. So I now have my slope. If you remember, the top number is supposed to be the y's, so we are going up 4, and the bottom number tells me I'm going over 1. So for my slope, I'm going up 4 over 1. So that was that part of the information. The rest of the equation tells me where I start. It's my y-intercept. So I also know that my y-intercept is a -3. So my y-intercept is -3. If this were an xy coordinate point, it was a y-intercept, so it's the y part. If it is an intercept, that meant it was on an axis, which meant the other number had to be 0. So this is our starting point. We're going to start here, and then we're going to use the slope, and we're going to move over, and we're going to find all the other missing points. So here's my graph paper, covering up the rest of the problem. So there's my graph paper. This tells me where to start. I'm starting at -3. So here's me starting on the y-axis at -3. You told me my slope was up 4 over 1. So my slope is up 1, 2, 3, 4 over 1. There's my point. Up 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 over 1. There's my new point. So I've got 3 points on my graph paper, which means I can now connect all those points with a line. So here's my ruler, connecting with a straight line and making sure that straight line has little arrows on the end because it goes infinitely on in both directions. Verify. You started at the point -3. I went ahead and crossed my y-axis at -3. Verify you're actually moving up 4 over 1 to get to every new point. If I started here, I went up 1, 2, 3, 4, went over 1. That point worked. If I was here, up 1, 2, 3, 4 over 1, that point worked. So I did go up 4 over 1 every single time. So our next example problem, we're supposed to make sure that it is first in slope-intercept form, because this is how we learn to graph it. The first part is supposed to be y equals, it's y equals. I'm then supposed to follow with my number x. The next thing is not my number x. I can see that my number x is the -2/3 x is written right here. So I need to rearrange. And then my whole plane number with nothing next to it, is a +2. I need to rearrange everything and make sure that it's in slope-intercept form. So y equals, supposed to have my whole number with the x, my slope with the x. Slope was in -2/3, connected to x. My y-intercept, the whole lonely number without any letter, is a +2. +2. I am now in slope-intercept form. You said that my slope was a -2/3 because that is the number stuck to x. Slope is always stuck to x. The negative is going to be attached to the 2. So this is a -2 over 3. Remembering slope is how we move across the line. If you remember the formula, the top number was the rising, the bottom number was the running, which means I'm supposed to be rising -2. So I'm going down 2, and I'm running over 3. So down 2 over 3 is how I'm going to move across the line to find every single new point. So this is how I move. You can also identified that my y-intercept was a positive 2. So if this were an xy coordinate point, it was a y-intercept. So the y is the 2. Since it is an intercept, that meant our x was always 0. So we know where we start. We're supposed to start at our y-intercept, and our slope tells us how to move across the line to find all of our new points. So if this is my graph paper, I need to start at the y-intercept at 2. So the y-axis crossed right here at 2. And now I'm supposed to move down 2 over 3. So I'm supposed to go down 2, down 1, 2, over 3, 1, 2, 3. Down 2, 1, 2, over 3, 1, 2, 3. Down 2, over 3. So those are all my points on my line. I need to connect it with a ruler. So here's my ruler. Make sure they all line up beautifully. Connect them with the straight line. The straight line has an arrow on each end, and then you're done. So we're supposed to make sure that this is put in slope-intercept form. I can straight up see that this is not in slope-intercept form because it's supposed to be y equals. It's not y equals. So I need to use my chapter 2 skills, and I need to get y completely by itself. So first, I know this 3x needs to be on the other side because y needs to be by itself. So I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides because I want it to completely up and disappear. If I had 3x's and I took away those 3x's, it completely disappeared. It zeroed out. I was left with this 2y, and this is literally just 8 minus 3x. So this is 8 minus 3x. I need y completely by itself. Y is stuck to the 2 by multiplication. You undo by dividing. If I divide this side, I'm supposed to divide the entire right side. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so I'm left with y equals, everything in here is being divided by 2. Everything. So this 8 was divided by 2, and this negative 3 is divided. If you can simplify this, you need to. So y equals 8 divided by 2 is 4 minus 3 divided by 2. I don't want decimals. It's 3 over 2 x. Now this needed to be in slope-intercept form. It is y equals, but I noticed the whole number next to the x is not written first. My whole number next to the x needs to be written first. So I'm going to rearrange these two. So y equals, I wanted the negative 3/2 x written first. So negative 3/2 x is written first. And then that positive 4 is the only number without any letter. So plus 4, plus 4. So now I am in slope-intercept form. So now let's go ahead and find our stuff. The number next to x is slope. So my slope is a number negative 3 over 2. Remembering the top number was the rising. So this must be down 3 and it's over 2. So to find all of my new points, I'm going down 3 over 2 every single time. The other piece of information I needed was my y-intercept. The y-intercept is the lonely number without any letter. My y-intercept is 4, the lonely number without any letter. What is this in terms of an xy coordinate point? If it is a y-intercept, the 4 is the y. Since it is an intercept, that meant it was on an axis, which meant the other number was 0. So let's go ahead and graph this. So here's my graph paper. You are telling me that my y-intercept, where I cross the y-axis, is 4. So here is where I cross my y-axis at 4. So this is where we started. And then we're supposed to use the slope, and the slope tells us how to move across to the next number. So if I started here, I now need to go down 3 over 2. So I go down 3 over 2, down 3 over 2, down 3 over 2. And then I can go ahead and I connect these with a straight line, and the line needs to have little arrows at the end, and you're done. So our next equation that we need to make sure is in slope-intercept form. I needed the y equals. Technically I have a y equals, but it's on the other side. So I'm going to completely flip-flop this over. So if this side said y and this side said a 2/3 x, and they were connected by equals, completely flipped it. So y equals, number stuck to x, number stuck to x. I'm out of stuff. I needed to add a number without any letter next to it. I don't have anything. Well, if you don't have anything, that means it's because it was a plus 0. So here it is in slope-intercept form. I needed my slope. The slope tells me how I move across my line. My slope is the number stuck to x. So my slope is 2/3. Remembering that slope is rise over run. So the top number tells me I rise, so I'm going up 2. And the bottom number tells me I'm running, so I'm running over 3. But this tells me how I move across the line. So this is my moving. I can't move unless I knew where to start. The starting is the y-intercept. The y-intercept is the lonely number without any letter. My lonely number without any letter is 0. So if this were written as an xy coordinate point, the 0 is the y. Well, if it's an intercept, that meant the other one had to be a 0 as well. So this is where I'm starting, and then I can go ahead and move across using my slope. So here is my graph paper. You told me that I was starting at the y-intercept at 0, which meant I crossed the y-axis at 0. Here is my y-axis, and here's where it crosses at 0. That's also the point 0, 0. Now I'm supposed to move, and I'm moving up 2 over 3. So from here, up 2 over 3, up 2 over 3, up 2 over 3. I found a bunch of points in a line. So I'm going to go ahead and connect them with a point, connect them with a line. That line needs to have arrows on both ends. And then you're done. All right, our last example for today. This needs to be in slope-intercept form. It is not a y equals problem like it needs to be. So I need to solve for y and make sure y is completely by itself, which means this guy needs to completely up and disappear. To make him completely up and disappear, I pair him with a negative 6x. So I have to do it on the other side. 6x minus 6x turns to 0. It's zeroed out, so I'm left with 2y equal. This is 10 minus 6x minus 6x. The y needs to be completely by itself. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. Everything gets divided by 2. So y equals everything is divided by 2. So this 10 was divided by 2. And this negative 6 was divided by 2. The x just kind of tagged along. Simplify it if you are able to. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Minus 6 divided by 2 is 3. The x was stuck to that. It is y equals, but notice the number in the x is written second. This needed to be written first, so we're going to go ahead and rewrite it so it's written first. So y equals negative 3x should have been written first, and then we could have added that 5. So we just rearranged the right side so it looks like it's in slope-intercept form now. So now I need to pull the information so I can graph it. First, I need to know what my slope is. The slope is how I move. The number next to x is my slope, so my slope is a negative 3. But if you remember, slope has to be a fraction. Throw it over 1, and it's now a fraction. The top number is my rising. So since it's negative, that means I'm moving down 3. And since it is over 1, now it's got to move over 1. This is how we move. So now I need to figure out where to start. The y-intercept is where I start. The y-intercept is the lonely number without any letter. Lonely number without any letter is 5. So if I converted this to an xy coordinate point so I knew where to graph, the y-intercept, the y, is 5. Since it is an intercept, that meant the other number was a 0. This tells us where to start, and then the slope tells us how we move across the line. So here is my graph paper. I started at the y-axis on 5. So here's my y-axis crossing at 5. Now I need to move, and I'm moving down 3 over 1. So I move down 1, 2, 3 over 1. Down 3, 1, 2, 3 over 1. Down 3, 1, 2, 3 over 1. Got a few dots on my graph, so now I can connect them with a line. There's me connecting with a line, arrow on both sides, and you're done.
What did we learn today? I can write a linear equation in slope-intercept form. I can graph a line using slope-intercept form, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow in class.